Hey everyone. Tonight we begin on a narrow jungle trail where the only warning is the soft snap of a twig, and then silence broken only by a scream that never makes it past the trees. No gunfire, no battle cries, just the quiet cruelty of sharpened bamboo, coiled wires, and venom hidden beneath leaves. You've heard stories of firefights and napalm storms, but this war was also waged beneath the feet by an enemy you never saw, and traps you never heard, until it was too late. This isn't about the clash of armies, it's about the unseen war, where every step could be your last, and the jungle itself became the weapon. If unearthing history's silent horrors helps you sleep, please like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what's the one place you'd never walk barefoot again? Now steady your breath, watch the ground ahead, and follow me into the shadows where fear grows from the roots. As you step further into the deep, humid embrace of the jungle, the air thickens with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and an underlying current of something primal and ancient. Here, the very landscape itself breathes, sighs, and sometimes it strikes. This was the domain of the Viet Cong, an enemy less interested in pitched battles and more in a silent, creeping mastery of the terrain. They understood the whisper of the wind through the tall grass, the subtle shifts in the soil beneath your boots, the way shadows played tricks on the eyes. You are not just walking through a forest, you are entering a living, breathing labyrinth, where the enemy is less an army and more a phantom, blending seamlessly with civilian villagers, disappearing into the very fabric of daily life. Their greatest weapon wasn't a rifle or a grenade, but the chilling element of surprise, a sudden, unexpected blow from a place you never saw coming. Imagine, if you will, the ground beneath your feet. It looks solid, deceptively so. But beneath that thin layer of soil and tangled roots lies another world, a vast, intricate network of tunnels stretching for miles, like the veins of a sleeping giant. The Ku Chi tunnels, for example, were not merely escape routes, they were an entire subterranean existence. As you mentally descend, you feel the cool, damp earth pressing in around you. These were living quarters, where families slept in suffocating quiet, their dreams haunted by the distant rumble of the surface world. They were hospitals, makeshift havens where the wounded whispered in pain, their injuries tended by the faint glow of a candle, the air thick with the smell of medicine and fear. They were weapon caches, hidden arsenals where the tools of war lay dormant, awaiting their moment. And, most chillingly, they were staging areas for ambushes, where soldiers would emerge from the earth like wraiths, strike with sudden, brutal force, and then vanish again, leaving behind only the echo of chaos and the lingering question of where they had gone. Into these pitch-black arteries of the earth ventured the tunnel rats. Envision their desperate bravery, small American soldiers, often volunteers, who would crawl through these claustrophobic passages. You feel the damp earth pressing against your skin, the absolute, suffocating darkness that swallows all light. Every inch forward is a gamble. You are moving through a space so tight, so constricted, that you can barely breathe, your heart hammering against your ribs. Your hand stretches out into the void, feeling for any tripwire, any hidden blade, any telltale sign of an enemy waiting in the blackness. The air is stale, heavy with the scent of soil and the faint, unsettling odor of human presence. Each breath is shallow, each movement slow and deliberate. You never know what's waiting around the next bend. or if the very ground you're crawling on will give way beneath you. It's a silent, terrifying dance with death, played out in the suffocating quiet beneath the earth. And as you emerge, perhaps back into the dim light of the jungle, the memory of that suffocating darkness clings to you. A cold, silent reminder of the war waged not on the surface, but deep within the very roots of the earth. You continue your slow, deliberate walk, your eyes now instinctively scanning the ground, searching for anything amiss. The jungle floor is a tapestry of fallen leaves, decaying wood, and tangled roots, each step a potential gamble. Here, the natural world itself was weaponized, transformed by cunning hands into instruments of silent terror. The most infamous of these, the Punji stick traps, were a stark testament to the ingenuity and brutality of this hidden war. Imagine the earth opening up, not with a roar, but with a silent, waiting maw. Beneath a thin, camouflaged layer of foliage lay a pit, often no wider than a foot or two, yet deep enough to conceal a nightmare. Within these pits, the very heart of the jungle, bamboo, was twisted into a cruel purpose. These were not just sticks, they were sharpened stakes, honed to a needlepoint, driven into the earth at an angle, waiting. And what made them truly insidious was not just their sharpness, but what they carried. You can almost smell the rancid odor, the unsettling thought of what coated their tips, often smeared with human feces, sometimes with potent poisons from the jungle's hidden pharmacopoeia, or simply rotting organic matter. The intent was not necessarily instant death, but something far more agonizing and strategically cunning infection. A wound from a Punji stick was a lingering torment, a source of fever, gangrene, and debilitating pain, designed to drain resources, morale, and manpower from the enemy. A soldier struck down by a Punji pit wasn't just a casualty. They became a burden, requiring evacuation, medical attention, and weeks, perhaps months, of recovery, tying up valuable assets and creating a ripple effect of disruption. You feel the slight give of the ground beneath your foot, a subtle unevenness that makes your heart skip a beat. These traps were placed with chilling precision along narrow, well-worn trails where patrols would instinctively follow. Near the banks of rivers, where soldiers might pause to drink or wash. And, most disturbingly, close to the hidden entrances of those vast tunnel networks, acting as silent sentinels, catching the unwary. Each location was chosen to maximize the chance of striking an unsuspecting victim, turning routine movements into treacherous journeys. You might recall the quiet, grim story of U.S. Marine Frank Harbert, who, while on patrol, felt that sudden, searing pain as his foot plunged into the unseen maw of a Punji pit. The immediate agony, the shock, and then the slow, creeping dread of what festered on the bamboo. He was removed from action for weeks, not from a bullet, but from a sharpened piece of wood, coated in silent venom. The silence of the jungle is punctuated by the buzzing of insects, the distant call of a bird, and your own steady breath. But beneath it all, you feel the echo of that unseen horror, the constant, low thrum of anxiety that must have permeated every single step. The very act of walking, once an unconscious movement, transformed into a tense, deliberate dance with unseen dangers. And as your foot lifts, gingerly, from the ground, you imagine the quiet patience of those who set these traps, knowing that the jungle in its slow, relentless way, would eventually deliver its quiet, cruel message. The feeling of vulnerability lingers, a subtle chill that reminds you how easily the earth can betray you, even in its most verdant embrace. As your journey continues, the quiet rustle of leaves beneath your feet becomes a symphony of potential threats. The Punji pits were silent, but another, more jarring form of terror lay hidden: the booby traps and landmines, designed not just to wound, but to shatter the very calm you try to cultivate within yourself. These were not subtle whispers of the jungle. They were sudden, violent shouts from the earth itself, aimed squarely at the mind. This was psychological warfare in its most brutal form, turning every step into a moment of agonizing anticipation. You are no longer just walking. You are performing a delicate, constant assessment of the ground, your senses on high alert for any anomaly. Imagine the oppressive humidity of the jungle, the way the air hangs heavy and still. Then, a sudden, inexplicable sound. Perhaps a slight click, or the softest tremor in the ground. Your mind races. Was that your imagination, or was it the prelude to the bouncing Betty mine? You conjure the image of this insidious device buried just beneath the surface. It doesn't detonate on impact. Instead, triggered by light pressure, it springs into the air, reaching waist height before exploding with devastating force. You can almost feel the concussive wave, the shrapnel tearing through the air, aimed not at the legs, but at the torso, at the vital organs. The chilling design was to inflict maximum damage, to maim and to kill with a sudden, airborne violence that left no time for reaction, only for the sudden, dreadful realization that your brief reprieve from the ground had delivered you directly into the heart of an explosion. Then there were the smaller, more personal terrors, like the toe poppers. You imagine the quiet horror of these tiny, yet incredibly destructive devices, designed specifically to blow off feet. They were often camouflaged with disturbing effectiveness, nestled amidst roots or buried shallowly in the soil. You step, perhaps on a slightly raised lump of dirt, and then a deafening report. The ground erupting beneath you, sending shards of metal and earth skyward. The aim was simple: to incapacitate, to render a soldier utterly vulnerable, turning a walk into a nightmare of dismemberment and the agonizing realization that a single misplaced step could forever alter your life. You might try to suppress the vivid image, but the quiet knowledge of such a threat lingers, a shadow over every cautious stride. Another chilling invention, the grenade in a can, played on the most innocent of disturbances. You visualize an ordinary tin can, perhaps discarded by a previous patrol, seemingly harmless. But beneath it, rigged with rubber bands and tripwires, lay a live grenade. The slightest disturbance a kick, a nudge, the innocent brush of a boot, and the tension would release, detonating the explosive within. It was a cruel trick, transforming everyday objects into instruments of terror, forcing soldiers to view everything with suspicion, to distrust the very ground they walked on, and the seemingly innocuous debris scattered across it. Private Leonard Thompson's grim reflection echoes in your mind. Every step could be your last. This profound anxiety, this constant, gnawing fear, was the true weapon. It wasn't just about the physical wounds. It was about the invisible scars etched into the mind. The perpetual state of vigilance that exhausted the spirit and slowly, inexorably, wore down the will to simply move forward. The jungle holds its breath with you as you take another quiet, measured step, wondering what silent scream the earth holds just beneath the surface. As you navigate the dense undergrowth, the jungle canopy above forms a muted cathedral, filtering the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. You've learned to watch your feet, but now you must lift your gaze, for the threats here ascend from the ground or plummet from above. This chapter of the silent war unfolds with a chilling precision, ensnaring soldiers in a different kind of terror, the sudden, inescapable embrace of nets and pits. The psychological impact here shifts from the immediate blast to the utter helplessness of being caught, suspended, or plunged into a dark abyss. Imagine moving through the thick foliage, pushing aside hanging vines, your senses attuned to every rustle. Without warning, a camouflaged net, expertly woven from local materials, is triggered by a nearly invisible tripwire. One moment, you're on solid ground. The next, you are yanked violently into the air, ensnared like a helpless animal. You feel the rough fibers of the net tightening around you, the sudden rush of air as you ascend, the disorientation as the world spins. These man-catchers were often rigged to pull soldiers up into the branches, leaving them suspended, vulnerable, and often critically injured. Sometimes, they were deployed in conjunction with those dreadful Punji pits, ensuring that a fall from the net would result in an impalement below. Compounding the horror, the sheer indignity of being caught, trapped, and exposed high above the ground must have been a profound shock, breaking the careful rhythm of patrol and shattering any illusion of control. The quiet creak of the rope, the sudden lurch, and then the helpless swing. These were the sounds of despair in the green heart of the jungle. Then, you consider the chilling opposite, the falling traps, also known as tiger traps. You picture a seemingly innocuous patch of ground, perhaps covered by a thin layer of leaves or a cleverly disguised mat of vegetation. But beneath this fragile surface, the earth had been hollowed out, creating a deep pit. And within this pit, like the fangs of some prehistoric beast, stood an array of sharpened bamboo spikes, pointing upward. As with the Punji sticks, these spikes were often smeared with toxins, ensuring that even a non-fatal fall would lead to excruciating pain and potentially deadly infection. You can almost feel the sudden give beneath your feet, the terrifying moment of free fall, followed by the sickening thud and the searing pain of impalement. You recall the chilling incident of the South Vietnamese soldier who witnessed his friend vanish into such a trap. The sound, perhaps a muffled cry, then the awful silence. And then, the agonizing realization that extraction was nearly impossible without inflicting further, massive injury. The image of a friend, alive but impaled, unable to be rescued without causing more harm, weighs heavily on your mind. The sheer cruelty of such a design, turning the very act of offering aid into a dilemma of horrific proportions, speaks volumes about the psychological torment these traps inflicted. There was no easy escape, no quick solution, just the prolonged agony of a body trapped and decaying, serving as a ghastly warning. The air feels heavy with unseen stories as you step carefully over what appears to be stable ground, your mind now alert to the deceptive patterns of shadows and the whispered possibility of a sudden, terrifying drop into the earth's waiting maw. As you push deeper, the jungle's symphony of unseen life swells around you, the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of unseen creatures. But here, even nature's quiet beauty could be twisted into a weapon. The Viet Cong's mastery extended beyond static traps. They harnessed the living, breathing dangers of the environment, transforming venomous animals and everyday sustenance into instruments of terror and sabotage. You begin to feel the prickle of unease not just on the ground, but in the air, in the very fabric of your surroundings. Imagine the end of a long, exhausting day. The weary comfort of finally settling down for a moment of rest. You lay out your sleeping bag, perhaps in a hidden clearing or a makeshift shelter. But the enemy had found a way to invade even this sacred space of respite. You picture the chilling scenario, a venomous snake, carefully placed within a sleeping bag, waiting in the folds of fabric. The unsuspecting soldier, seeking warmth and security, slides in, and then the sudden, searing bite, followed by the terrifying realization of what has coiled within their sanctuary. The venom courses through the veins, bringing with it a burning pain, a creeping paralysis, and the desperate, frantic race against time. Marine John Harker's close call echoes in your mind. The frantic scramble for medevac, the fight for his very life against an unseen, fanged attacker that nearly claimed him. The sheer violation of such a tactic, turning the promise of rest into a deadly ambush, leaves a lasting chill. Then, there were the scorpions. Their segmented bodies and venomous tails a symbol of quiet, creeping dread. You envision a bamboo cage, small and crude, with a live scorpion tied inside. This wasn't a trap for the jungle path, but a chilling instrument of psychological torture, fastened, perhaps around the neck of a prisoner. The close proximity of the venomous creature, the constant awareness of its movements, the knowledge that any sudden jolt or deliberate cruelty could release it, creating an agonizing, slow death. This was designed to break the spirit, to extract information through an unbearable, constant threat. The air feels heavy with the unspoken suffering, the quiet terror of such a weapon. The insidious nature of this silent war extended even to the most basic human needs, food and water. You consider the constant vigilance required, the nagging doubt that must have accompanied every meal, every sip of water. Food and water were poisoned, not always to kill, but to cause debilitating illness, to spread dysentery, to erode the physical strength and, more critically, the morale of the opposing forces. This was sabotage aimed at the very core of survival, creating a pervasive sense of mistrust and vulnerability. You might imagine the whispered warning, a chilling threat used against deserters or informants. Every meal you eat will be your last. It was a declaration designed to instill absolute obedience through the ultimate fear, turning nourishment into a potential final act. The jungle, with its hidden life and its vital resources, became a source of constant suspicion, a place where even the most fundamental elements of survival were turned into a weapon against you. The subtle, sweet smell of a blossoming flower, or the innocent drip of water from a leaf, might now carry with it an unseen, silent dread. You press onward, the foliage growing denser, the light dimming to a perpetual twilight beneath the heavy canopy. The jungle here feels alive, not just with innocent creatures, but with an unseen tension, a network of invisible threads woven through the very air. Here, the unseen war manifests not as static pits or living creatures, but as sudden, violent movements, the snap and slide of ingenious wire traps designed to maim with lightning speed. You learn to walk not just by sight, but by feeling the subtle vibrations of the air, the imperceptible tension in the forest. Consider the snap traps, simple in their concept, devastating in their execution. You visualize a strong, flexible piece of bamboo, or even a young tree, bent back with immense force, its tension held by a delicate tripwire strung across a narrow path. Attached to the end of this spring-loaded weapon is a sharp hook, often crafted from metal or a hardened piece of wood. You are walking, perhaps lost in thought for a brief moment, and your foot brushes against that nearly invisible thread. The tension is instantly released, with a chilling whoosh that barely registers before impact. The bamboo or tree snaps forward, launching the hook with incredible velocity directly into flesh. You can almost feel the searing pain, the sudden, violent impact as the hook slams into a leg, an arm, or even the torso. Private James O'Neill's quiet, vivid memory of a hook slamming into his leg paints a grim picture of this sudden, brutal encounter. The immediate shock, the tearing of tissue, and the subsequent, agonizing difficulty of extraction without further injury. These were designed not necessarily for death, but for the immediate, debilitating wound, rendering a soldier immobile and requiring immediate, often perilous, evacuation. The jungle, once a passive observer, suddenly becomes an active participant, its very branches striking out with a silent, deadly efficiency. Then, there were the slide traps, a different kind of sudden betrayal from the earth itself. You envision a slope, seemingly natural and innocuous, perhaps covered in a thin layer of leaves and debris. But beneath this thin veneer, the ground has been subtly altered, creating a treacherous incline. A tripwire, almost imperceptible, stretches across the top of this disguised slope. Your foot connects with the wire, and suddenly, the ground beneath you gives way, a section of the slope sliding out from under your weight. You are no longer standing. You are falling, tumbling uncontrollably down the incline, propelled by the earth itself. And at the bottom of this hidden slide, a pit, of course, lined with those familiar, terrifying bamboo spikes. The terror is twofold: the dizzying, helpless slide, the loss of all control, followed by the sickening certainty of what awaits you at the bottom. These traps were terrifying in both their design and their execution. They played on the natural contours of the land, turning seemingly safe passage into a deadly ambush. They instilled a deep, pervasive distrust not just of the immediate ground, but of the very topography of the jungle. Every slight incline, every seemingly harmless dip, could conceal a hidden slope leading to disaster. The silence of the jungle is punctuated by the imagined echoes of these sudden, violent movements: the snap of a branch, the slide of earth, the inevitable, horrifying impact. As you move forward, each step is now accompanied by a silent, internal question: is this ground truly solid? Or is it a carefully disguised trap, waiting to unleash its sudden, striking violence? The jungle continues its silent, relentless watch, its unseen threads ready to bind and break. The pervasive threat of the unseen enemy could have crippled the spirit. But in the face of such cunning, a quiet determination emerged. The war below the surface spurred innovation, a meticulous counter-strategy designed to outwit the jungle's silent weapons. You shift your focus now from the fear of the unknown to the patient, methodical work of those who sought to bring light into the shadows. This was a battle of wits, A quiet chess match played out in the suffocating heat of the jungle, and it was led by individuals like Captain Ernest Ernie Brace, whose dedication became a beacon against the unseen terror. You envision Captain Brace, not with a weapon raised, but with a quiet, analytical gaze, poring over captured traps. He would painstakingly dismantle them, studying every knot, every pivot, every subtle mechanism, trying to understand the mind of the enemy who crafted them. This wasn't about brute force. It was about intelligence, about learning the silent language of the jungle's deception. He would then impart this hard-won knowledge to his soldiers, teaching them to read the subtle signs that betrayed a hidden danger. You imagine the intense training, the quiet lessons in the field, how to detect the faintest disturbance in the soil, the barely visible sheen of a tripwire stretched between two trees, the slight, unnatural bend in vegetation that signaled an alteration. It was about sharpening senses, transforming ordinary vision into a finely tuned instrument of detection. As soldiers became more attuned, specialized tools became standard issue, quiet extensions of their vigilance. You picture the trap probes, long, slender rods carefully used to prod the ground ahead, feeling for hollow spaces or hidden wires. Each gentle prod was a moment of suspense, a delicate dance with danger, the metal tip searching for a telltale void. Then, the development of puncture-resistant boots. You feel the weight of them, the promise of protection they offered, a sturdy barrier against the unseen spikes lurking just beneath the surface. These weren't just pieces of equipment. They were small measures of hope, tangible efforts to reclaim a degree of safety in a perpetually dangerous environment. Perhaps the most comforting allies in this silent battle were the canine units. You imagine the German shepherds and Labrador retrievers, their powerful noses working tirelessly through the dense jungle. You see them, muscles tense, sniffing the air, their sensitive noses attuned to the faintest scent of human presence, or the disturbed earth that signaled a hidden trap. The quiet wag of a tail, the sudden freeze, the gentle nudge of a nose towards a suspicious spot, these were vital warnings, saving countless lives. The bond between soldier and dog in this quiet, anxious hunt must have been profound, a silent pact against the pervasive threat. Back home, engineers worked tirelessly, their minds focused on protecting those in the field. You envision the careful design of lightweight body armor, offering protection without hindering movement, and reinforced helmets, a silent shield against airborne shrapnel. These were innovations born of necessity, quiet acts of care reaching across oceans, striving to make the invisible visible and the vulnerable protected. The jungle might whisper its threats, but human ingenuity, backed by quiet courage, whispered back, "Not today." As your journey through the jungle's unseen war draws to a reflective pause, the mind begins to wander, to connect these specific horrors to a larger, timeless tapestry of human conflict. The Viet Cong's mastery of deception, their ability to weaponize the unseen and the unexpected, was not an isolated phenomenon, but rather a chilling echo of strategies as old as warfare itself. You find yourself considering the deeper currents of history, recognizing the subtle, enduring patterns of misdirection and cunning that permeate the annals of human struggle. You might ponder how, throughout history, the most cunning minds have understood that conflict is not always about overwhelming force, but about outsmarting, outwitting, and often out-deceiving your adversary. The North Koreans, for instance, learned from similar playbooks, constructing their own vast networks of camouflaged bunkers and tunnels beneath the earth, designed to hide their true strength and intentions from the probing eyes of the enemy. You can almost feel the continuity, the shared strategic DNA between these distant conflicts, the same primal impulse to become invisible, to strike from the shadows. Then, your thoughts drift to the grand, almost theatrical deceptions of World War II. You conjure the image of the Ghost Army, a phantom force of American artists and engineers who, with breathtaking ingenuity, created an elaborate illusion. You see the inflatable tanks, large and imposing, yet easily deflated and moved, meant to fool aerial reconnaissance. You hear the fabricated radio signals, carefully crafted to mimic the chatter of a massive army on the move, diverting enemy attention. You imagine the German intelligence officers listening intently, believing in the presence of divisions that were nothing more than canvas and sound. It was a war waged on the airwaves and across vast, empty fields. A masterpiece of illusion where perception was more powerful than reality. Even more audacious, perhaps, was the British Operation Mincemeat, a deception so bold it feels like something from a spy novel. You envision the meticulous planning, the careful placement of fabricated documents onto the corpse of a vagrant, dressed as a Royal Marine officer. This body, carrying false intelligence about Allied invasion plans, was then allowed to wash ashore in Spain. Knowing it would fall into enemy hands, the audacity, the quiet confidence in the enemy's predictable response is stunning. You feel the cold calculation behind such a maneuver, the willingness to exploit human curiosity and credulity for strategic gain. And then, going back even further, to the very dawn of recorded history, you consider the most famous deception of all the Trojan horse. You picture the immense wooden beast, a seemingly innocent gift left on the shores, concealing within its hollow belly the very soldiers who would bring about the city's downfall. The image is iconic, a timeless testament to the power of a cleverly disguised threat, a symbol of how trust can be manipulated and how something seemingly benign can harbor ultimate destruction. It all resonates with the ancient wisdom of Sun Tzu, the venerable strategist whose words echo through the ages. All warfare is based on deception. The silent war in Vietnam, with its hidden traps and unseen enemies, was simply another chapter in humanity's long-hauled, complex story of trying to gain an advantage by tricking the eye, baffling the mind, and turning the expected into the utterly unforeseen. The jungle, too, was a Trojan horse, its innocent beauty hiding a world of carefully laid traps. As you step out of the dense canopy and into a clearing, the silence of the jungle begins to feel different, heavier, laden with unspoken stories. The physical scars of this unseen war were profound, but the deepest wounds were often invisible, etched into the minds and spirits of those who walked these treacherous paths. You feel the lingering echoes of constant fear, a persistent thrum of anxiety that must have accompanied every breath, every movement. Imagine the relentless pressure of knowing that any step could be your last, that the very ground beneath your feet harbored a silent, waiting horror. This pervasive fear led to a profound mental exhaustion. You can almost feel the weariness in your bones, the dull ache in your mind from perpetual vigilance. Sleep would have been fleeting, haunted by nightmares of unseen snares. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, every shadow playing tricks on the eye, would have triggered a jolt of adrenaline, keeping the nervous system perpetually frayed. This wasn't the sudden, acute terror of a firefight, but a slow, insidious erosion of peace. A constant low-grade dread that permeated every waking moment. Morale, too, suffered under this relentless psychological assault. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see, whose weapons are hidden, whose tactics defy conventional warfare? The trust in the ground, in the environment, in the very act of walking, was shattered. In response, tactics shifted. Larger units, once lumbering through the terrain, became less effective. The emphasis shifted to smaller, more agile units. To reconnaissance tactics, quiet patrols designed to observe, to gather intelligence, to avoid direct engagement where the hidden traps held such an advantage. You imagine these small groups, moving like shadows through the jungle, their senses hyper-alert, their movements precise and deliberate. It was a grim dance of survival, born from the necessity to navigate a landscape that was actively trying to ensnare them. And even today, decades later, the silent war continues its grim legacy. You consider the land itself, still dangerous, still holding the silent, deadly remnants of conflict. Unexploded traps and landmines, laid so long ago, still plague regions across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The earth, in its slow, patient way, holds on to these remnants, delivering a brutal reminder of past conflicts. Children playing in fields, farmers tilling their land. Innocent lives continue to be shattered by these unseen dangers. You envision the quiet dedication of individuals like Aki Ra, a former Khmer Rouge child soldier turned humanitarian. His own childhood was shaped by the violence and the pervasive threat of these hidden explosives. Now, he dedicates his life to the painstaking, dangerous work of demining Cambodia, painstakingly removing the silent killers one by one. His work is a testament to the enduring scar tissue of war, a quiet effort to heal the very land, step by careful step, so that others might walk freely, without the chilling anticipation of a sudden, shattering explosion. The jungle whispers still. But now, perhaps, there is a faint echo of hope, a gentle promise of future steps taken without fear. As our long journey through the silent terrors of the jungle concludes, you find yourself in a space of quiet contemplation, listening for the echoes of those who lived through these unseen horrors. Their voices, even when heard as whispers, carry the profound weight of experience, sketching vivid pictures of moments that altered lives forever. You listen, not just with your ears, but with your heart, trying to comprehend the sheer human cost of a war waged beneath the feet. You imagine John Thompson, his voice calm yet heavy with the memory, recounting the moment a teammate triggered a tripwire. You don't need to see the scene. You feel the sudden lurch in your stomach, the sound that must have pierced the jungle's quiet hum, followed by the sickening realization of what had just happened. The image of a limb lost, not in a blaze of glory, but to an unseen wire, is a stark reminder of the indiscriminate cruelty of these traps. You picture the quiet heroism of those who would then rush to aid, knowing that the act of helping might expose them to further danger. Then, there is James Walker, his words painting a picture of sharp, sudden pain as his leg was punctured by a wire trap. You feel the tearing sensation, the immediate incapacitation, and the slow, creeping dread of being caught, vulnerable, in the heart of enemy territory. His experience is a testament to the swift, unforgiving efficiency of these silent weapons, turning a moment of movement into a crisis of survival. You might close your eyes and imagine the long, arduous recovery. The physical and emotional scars left by such an unexpected injury. The voice of Nurse Patricia Johnson carries a different kind of quiet sorrow. She tells of a soldier brought to her, suffering from a deadly snake bite. You envision the frantic efforts, the desperate struggle against the potent venom coursing through his veins. The quiet despair as his life slowly ebbed away, despite every medical intervention. Her story is a poignant reminder that not all battles were fought with bullets, and not all enemies were human. The raw power of nature, weaponized, could be just as lethal, leaving behind a grief as profound as any battlefield casualty. You feel the helplessness, the quiet tragedy of losing a life to an unseen, slithering threat. And finally, you hear the haunting words of Nguyen, a former South Vietnamese soldier whose experience delves into the darkest corners of human cruelty. He recounts his capture and the unimaginable horror of being forced to watch comrades tortured with live scorpions, trapped in cages fastened to their necks. You don't need to see the graphic details, the sheer psychological torment of witnessing such an act. The chilling awareness of the venomous creature so close is enough to send a shiver down your spine. This was not about physical injury. It was about breaking the will, shattering the spirit, through a slow, agonizing psychological siege. His voice carries the weight of profound trauma, a memory that would forever be etched into his soul. A stark reminder of the depths of human suffering and the perverse ingenuity of those who wielded fear as their ultimate weapon. As these voices fade into the quiet hum of the night, you are left with the profound realization that war is not just grand battles and heroic charges. It is also the quiet terror of the unseen, the insidious fear of every step, the psychological toll of constant vigilance, and the lasting echoes of pain that whisper from the very earth itself. The jungle has told its stories, and in the quiet of your own space, you carry the weight of their remembrance, a silent tribute to those who walked where fear grew from the roots. In 1954, the First Indochina War between French colonial forces and Ho Chi Minh's communist revolutionaries comes to an end after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. In the following Geneva Accords, the US, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China agreed to divide Vietnam into two temporary states along the 17th parallel. The Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, led by Ho Chi Minh, and non-communist state of Vietnam in the south, led by former Emperor Bao Dai. The country is supposed to be reunified after elections planned for 1956. The deal is less than Ho Chi Minh hoped. He fought for a single unified Vietnamese state, but his Chinese and Soviet supporters pressure him into accepting compromise, since they want to prevent further US intervention in Asia. For France, the deal lets them end an unpopular war and quietly leave the region. So, the Geneva Accords serve the major powers, but don't solve the fundamental concerns of Vietnamese nationalists. Although the US takes an active role in the talks, it publicly downplayed its involvement as a mere interested nation. Washington is concerned about concessions to the communists, and it had militarily supported France during the Indochina War. Although the US decided against armed intervention at Dien Bien Phu, CIA pilots flew supplies into the besieged base. But now, with the French on their way out, President Eisenhower increases support to the state of Vietnam, free from European colonial overtones. Despite the planned elections, the U.S. starts a nation-building program in the South. Washington supports the South for one major reason: fear of communist expansion. For the U.S., Ho Chi Minh is a puppet of Soviet communism. If Vietnam falls, Laos, Cambodia, India, Burma, Thailand, the rest of Southeast Asia, and maybe even Australia could follow like tumbling dominoes. As French administrators leave, the U.S. identifies Bao Dai's prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, as the most viable alternative to Ho Chi Minh. Although Diem lacks charisma, he's an anti-French, a Catholic nationalist, and fervently anti-communist. The U.S. hopes that under their guidance, he can introduce democratic reforms and stop communism's spread. But not everyone is enthusiastic for Diem or the state of Vietnam. General Matthew Ridgway, former U.S. commander in Korea in World War II, strongly opposes the U.S. commitment. He worries the U.S. will become bogged down in another ideological struggle in Asia, which firepower alone will not solve. Diem's democratic credentials aren't very reassuring either. In October 1955, Diem removes Bao Dai in a referendum, creating the Republic of Vietnam in the South. He supposedly wins 98.91% of the vote, raising some eyebrows in Washington. But his recent ability to suppress communists, as well as criminal syndicates and militant religious sects, leads to U.S. approval. Around the same time, military advisors arrive with CIA representatives in tow. The U.S. now pours resources into South Vietnam. In the late 1950s, the U.S. provides $250 million per year, around $2.75 billion today. But little goes to building South Vietnam's economic base. 80% goes to the military, especially the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN. With these forces, Diem tightens his control. In 1956, Diem replaces traditional village chiefs with Saigon officials. Many village leaders are thought to harbor communist sympathies, but their removal leads to rural discontent. Re-education programs and slow land reform do not help matters. There is also a security clampdown. By 1958, Saigon has arrested 25,000 people and 90% of the Communist Party's important members in the South. Diem's decree, 10-59, outlaws most opposition and refuses to recognize communist resistance against the French. A Saigon newspaper carries his declaration. The Indochinese Communist Party pursued communist objectives and sought to turn Vietnam into a colony and the Vietnamese into the slaves of red imperialism. They are communists, traitors, and agents of Russia and China. Diem's security forces, often minority Catholics, also target middle-class intellectuals and Buddhists, who they see as centers of political opposition. Diem makes it clear he will not honor the 1956 unification referendum as promised by the Geneva Accords, because he claims no free election can happen in the Communist North. The U.S. approves, but largely because they expect Ho Chi Minh to easily win. Instead, Eisenhower invites Diem to Washington to show support. Diem is an example for people everywhere who hate tyranny and love freedom. Meanwhile, in the North, frustration is building. Ho Chi Minh officially forbids Southern communists from committing violence and instead concentrates on propaganda and building up the North. Estimates vary. But while enacting land reforms, Northern government agents execute around 15,000 North Vietnamese as supposed evil landlords and subversive elements. Ho's commander-in-chief, General Vo Nguyen Giap, later admits the crimes. We made too many deviations and executed too many honest people. Worse still, torture came to be regarded as a normal practice during party reorganization. Ho now faces pressure to increase military activity in the South. Some Southern communist groups are already ignoring his orders for nonviolence, and military leaders are increasingly sidelining their own leader. In 1959, the North officially supports a protracted armed struggle to overthrow the US DM regime. They infiltrate thousands of fighters and weapons into South via the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. In 1960, Vietnamese nationalists formed the National Liberation Front. Initially a broad organization of communists and non-communists, it closely cooperates with the Communist People's Liberation Armed Forces. Collectively, they become known as the Viet Cong, a short form of the words Vietnamese communist in Vietnamese. The name is used by Saigon newspapers to differentiate the southern insurgency groups from the northern Regular People's Army of Vietnam. But practically, the Northern Communist Party controls both organizations. Despite this, most of the NLF's members are native southern Vietnamese re-infiltrated from the north. Despite their basic equipment, writer Lee Lai Hayslip, who grew up in rural southern Vietnam, claims the Viet Cong had an important advantage over the urban and Catholic-dominated ARVN. In contrast to the AVRN, the Viet Cong were, for the most part, our neighbors. They did not insult us, because they had been raised exactly like us. Where the Republicans came into a village overburdened with American equipment designed for a different war, the Viet Cong made do with what they had, and seldom wasted their best ammunition, the goodwill of the people. As the Viet Cong expands, they step up their sabotage campaign. Edward Lansdale, a U.S. intelligence officer and counterinsurgency pioneer, delivers a stark warning to Washington, ARVN, in critical condition. Viet Cong have started to steal the country and expect to be done in 1961. Lansdale's solution is to provide more support to DM. For others in the administration, faith in DM is plummeting, but there is simply no one else to replace him. However, a new U.S. president means a new Vietnam policy. John F. Kennedy takes office in 1961 at a volatile time. Just prior to his inauguration, the Soviet Union announces to support all groups fighting wars of national liberation. So Kennedy delivers a strong message during his inauguration, original audio. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet in any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and success of liberty. Kennedy develops a new flexible response doctrine, where conventional and covert forces can be more widely used instead of just nuclear deterrence. His goal is not necessarily to defeat North Vietnam, but to ensure South Vietnam can resist the growing insurgency and, eventually, take over its own security. He also brings a new team into the Oval Office, including his so-called wise men advisors with backgrounds in the military and government, as well as business, finance, and academia. Perhaps the most influential is Robert McNamara. As a manager at the Ford Motor Company, his meticulous data-driven management approach was praised with saving the company. Kennedy now asks McNamara to bring the same number crunching to national security as Secretary of Defense. Kennedy's wise men encourage him to send more military advisors to Vietnam. By 1962, there are 11,300 of them, more than 10 times as many as under Eisenhower. The Geneva Agreement forbids any state from sending military personnel to either Vietnamese government. So advisors operate on technicalities, officially non-combat personnel. They received personal weapons when in Vietnam and can theoretically only act in self-defense. Some are training staff attached to ARVN. Others are special forces personnel that are technically civilian contractors. Throughout the 1960s, many also function as helicopter pilots ferrying ARVN troops. As their number grows, the U.S. sets up camps and barracks across South Vietnam, especially helicopter bases. Although ARVN continues to do most of the fighting, often with surplus U.S. World War II weapons, Advisors join patrols and occasionally become casualties. To manage this force, Kennedy establishes the Military Advisory Command, Vietnam, MACV. From 1962, MACV focuses on so-called strategic hamlets, specially fortified villages designed to keep out communist influence. The Americans entice locals into physically and ideologically secure villages with promises of material benefits and better services. By September 1962, 3 million villagers live in around 3,000 strategic hamlets. This, combined with counterinsurgency, covert patrols, and increased airstrikes against the Viet Cong, boost U.S. optimism. But even with increased American firepower, the Viet Cong strike back. American helicopters become valuable targets. ASUS Lut. Cole Archie Clapp recalls in 1962, the helicopter flight landed troops in their encircling positions. 8 of the 22 helicopters were hit at least once. Why? We wanted to know. Were we subjected to as heavy opposition when we were landing on the heel of an airstrike? We concluded that it was not in spite of, but because of the airstrike. When the airstrike started, the VC grabbed their guns and headed out of town to the intended helicopter landing sites. In January 1963, the Viet Cong gained their most significant victory yet. Around 350 guerrillas defeat a much larger ARVN force at Ap Bac, including repelling flame-throwing armored personnel carriers and shooting down 5 helicopters. U.S. advisors are surprised the Viet Cong stand their ground against air attacks, armored vehicles, and napalm. Meanwhile, despite their training, equipment, and support, the ARVN show poor leadership and little will to fight. There is more bad news for the U.S. throughout 1963 as religious tensions spike in Saigon. The South Vietnamese government continues to suppress Buddhists, overseen by Diem's brother and sister-in-law. Around 75% of South Vietnamese are nominally or culturally Buddhist. But the government pressures city populations, especially army officers, to convert. As Buddhist Jacques Duc recalls in spring 1963, there was tremendous pressure to become Catholic so you could get ahead. And we began hearing about a lot of secret conversions. I was incensed by what was going on, and I felt it was dangerous. The issue dramatically hits headlines on June 11th, when Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc burns himself to death on a busy Saigon intersection. After U.S. protest, Diem promises to introduce reforms, but his forces continue to raid Buddhist pagodas. To the U.S., Diem's government is now on its last legs. In August 1963, the U.S. learns of plans for a coup against Diem by army officers. Historians debate the level of U.S. involvement, but they certainly don't prevent the coup. Instead, U.S. officials inform the plotters they support South Vietnam, not a specific leader. On November 1st, South Vietnamese generals depose the government. They execute Diem and his brother in the back of an armored personnel carrier, an act which likely was not planned. This concerns the U.S., but they hope the military government will more aggressively take on the Viet Cong. Soon after, another surprise killing shocks the world. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. By the time of his death, 16,000 advisors are in Vietnam, and 100 have been killed. His vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, will now lead the war effort. Johnson always wanted to be president, but not a war president. His passion is domestic reforms he calls the Great Society. He sees Vietnam as a distraction in both time and resources from pressing issues at home. But 1964 is an election year, and Johnson's Republican rivals will take advantage of any apparent weakness against international communism. He later explains, in his trademark colorful language, I knew that if we let communist aggression succeed in taking over South Vietnam, there would follow an endless national debate that would shatter my presidency. I knew that Harry Truman and Dean Acheson lost their effectiveness from the day that the communists took over China. And I knew that all their problems, taken together, were chicken shit compared with what might happen if we lost Vietnam. So, Johnson keeps Kennedy's advisors and largely follows their advice on Vietnam. Despite wanting to keep U.S. involvement limited, he often agrees to their demands for further escalation. In December 1963, with the strategic Hamlet program crumbling under corruption and poor management, McNamara predicts a South Vietnamese collapse in 2 to 3 months. Johnson considers airstrikes or ground troops, but wants to put off the decision until after the coming election. Instead, he sends more advisors along with a new commander, General William Westmoreland, who prefers firepower and active operations to pacification and civilian programs. U.S. covert actions are not new. They've been happening across Vietnam since 1961. But the U.S. always maintains plausible deniability, like using Taiwanese pilots to parachute South Vietnamese groups into the north. By 1964, one such operation is Operational Plan 34 Alpha, or Plan 34A, which consists of commando raids along the North Vietnamese coast. Although the personnel may be South Vietnamese, Thai, Laotian, or Taiwanese, the raids are planned by MACV's Studies and Observations Group, a benign, bureaucratic name for the U.S. Special Forces and Covert Command. The U.S. Navy also carry out their own covert operations known as DeSoto patrols. U.S. destroyers with electronic surveillance equipment try to detect North Vietnamese communications and radar emissions. From a North Vietnamese perspective, the destroyers, supported by aircraft carriers, are likely motherships for the Plan raiders. This is not true. But both Plan and DeSoto missions often take place in the same general area, and although technically separate, DeSoto patrols provided intelligence for the coastal raids. In July and August 1964, American destroyer USS Maddox operates around the Gulf of Tonkin on a DeSoto mission. What was planned to be an uneventful cruise would soon result in one of Vietnam's greatest controversies. On the night of July 30th and 31st, 1964, Plan patrol boats bombard coastal North Vietnamese military installations. On August 1st, the Maddox enters the area. Its cruise is designed to be unprovocative and remain outside North Vietnamese waters. But the Maddox is as close as 14 kilometers to the shore, which North Vietnam considers within their territory. Unlike the U.S. interpretation, the North Vietnamese Navy assumes the American destroyer is responsible for the previous night's bombardment. On August 2nd, 3 Vietnamese torpedo boats head for the Maddox. The destroyer fires warning shots, then targets the boats. The North Vietnamese launch their torpedoes, but they miss. During the battle, the Maddox fires around 260 5-inch and 3-inch shells, but scores only 1 hit. The encounter increases tension among the inexperienced American crew. On August 4th, the Maddox re-enters the Gulf together with destroyer USS Turner Joy. The night is moonless and visibility is poor. The captains have been told to expect further attack and soon encounter unknown radar contacts. At 21:34 HUs, the Maddox opens fire. The Turner Joy joins soon after. Sonarmen on both ships report multiple enemy torpedoes in the water. Crewmen also report seeing their wakes. And enemy ships? As both U.S. ships fire, they claim they've damaged and sunk enemy vessels. By 22:30, the Maddox makes evasive maneuvers, while the Turner Joy drops depth charges and attempts to ram an enemy. After 2 hours, the battle is over. But not because the radar contacts disappear, Commander Herbert Ogier realizes the number of supposed contacts and torpedoes is reaching ridiculous proportions. He begins to wonder if the contacts are real, and if the Maddox and Turner Joy have just fired over 300 shells at nothing. Nevertheless, reports of a North Vietnamese attack are already on their way to Washington. Only on August 5th, when no one finds any debris of the destroyed enemy ships, does Captain Herrick on the Maddox send a skeptical report. But it's not a total denial an attack took place. Captain Barnhart of the Turner Joy still insists the attack happened. The Joint Chiefs of Staff urgently request information to give the President. As messages flurry across the Pacific, both sides prioritize supposed torpedo and ship sightings. In the following days, both captains say an attack took place, although not as large as they thought. Meanwhile, McNamara relies heavily on intercepted North Vietnamese Navy messages seemingly planning the attack. Johnson then orders retaliatory airstrikes at coastal bases in Vinh on August 5th. In the raid, North Vietnamese defenses shoot down 2 U.S. planes and kill 1 pilot. On August 10th, Johnson signs the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, allowing further retaliation. It's not a declaration of war, but says the President can repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The U.S. Congress overwhelmingly passes the resolution, and during the discussions, members condemn the unprovoked nature of the attack in international waters. Johnson doesn't tell Congress about Oplan or DeSoto. Instead, McNamara claims the Maddox was on a routine patrol through the area and would continue to do so. Original audio, Secretary McNamara. The destroyer was carrying out a mission, a patrol in those waters, in international waters, when it was attacked. It replied to the attack. It continued to carry out its mission today and will do so for the remainder of this week in the same waters. The President has asked that the destroyer force be doubled and a CAP, a combat air patrol, be available at all times on call to it, and as I think you know, he has issued instructions that in the event of further attack upon our vessels in international waters, we are to respond with the objective of destroying the attackers. Following the crisis, Johnson's approval rating remains high, and in November, he wins a landslide election. Still, he promises to keep ground troops out of Vietnam. So, what actually happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? There was certainly an attack on August 2nd, since North Vietnam confirmed it. But there was no attack on August 4th. Instead, the incident was likely the result of radar anomalies caused by weather, crew stress, miscommunication, and poor visibility. According to the Maddox logs, they identified 25 probable torpedoes during the second incident. But the North Vietnamese Navy only has 12 torpedo boats, 3 of which were damaged after the first attack, and each boat only carries 2 torpedoes. The destroyer's own frequent change in direction probably sounded like multiple incoming torpedoes to Maddox's sonarmen. Furthermore, if an attack did take place, the North Vietnamese would likely confirm it for propaganda value. But they deny it ever happened. McNamara's intercepted messages are probably poorly translated and refer to the recovery of ships damaged on August 2nd. Some historians have suggested the U.S. deliberately faked the attack as a provocation for war. This issue is still debated, but most historians conclude it's unlikely. It is possible some evidence was misrepresented, and Johnson knew the full details of the second incident by the time he went to Congress, but he had already made public declarations about the attack and his intention to respond, even if in a limited way. Original audio, President Johnson. The determination all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage. Yet our response, for the present, will be limited and fitting. So Johnson has gotten a congressional resolution, but he's reluctant to use it. U.S. planners draw up bombing lists for targets in North Vietnam. But they don't use them right away. Instead, U.S. planes secretly bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. This changes in early 1965. On February 7th, Viet Cong troops attack American advisors at Camp Holloway, killing 8 Americans and destroying or damaging 25 aircraft. On February 10th, a northern bomb attack at another barracks kills 23 more. Angering Johnson. We have kept our gun over the mantel and our shells in the cupboard for a long time now. And what was the result? They are killing our boys while they sleep in the night. On February 24th, U.S. aircraft attacked North Vietnamese targets between the 17th and 19th parallel. This soon develops into Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign designed to boost South Vietnamese morale and pressure North Vietnam into abandoning the Viet Cong. But although the U.S. effort is primarily from the air, they need regular ground troops to protect U.S. air bases, like the one at Da Nang. On March 8, 1965, 2 Marine battalions land to provide security. Their presence only provokes more Viet Cong attacks. Bombing also does little to stop Viet Cong activities. North Vietnam increases infiltrations, and regular army troops occasionally cross the 17th parallel. The Soviet Union and China, who have mostly stayed out of the war, now send anti-aircraft weapons to the north. Meanwhile, the southern government remains in turmoil. Since Diem's death, there have been 5 governments of ineffective military leaders. U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense William Bundy describes the latest ruling generals, Nguyen Van Thieu and Nguyen Cao Ky, as absolutely the bottom of the barrel. Westmoreland also concludes the ARVN can't hold the line. If the goal is to save South Vietnam, more American troops are needed. By July, Westmoreland gets his boots on the ground. Johnson agrees to send 50,000 troops for offensive operations. So why did the U.S. get further and further into the Vietnam conflict? The fear of communist expansion is perhaps the primary cause. South Vietnam was not democratic, but American leaders felt it needed to be a bulwark against communism. This is made crystal clear in a secret U.S. memorandum in 1965 U.S. Objective in South Vietnam is not to help friend, but to contain China. There are other reasons as well. Abandoning a nation the U.S. had publicly pledged to support would be a global humiliation, and a personal one for Johnson. With Kennedy's legacy looming large over his presidency, he felt compelled to follow his commitment, although some historians suggest Kennedy considered withdrawal before his assassination. The Americans also expect to win. Many in the administration felt communist success until 1965 is not due to their strength, but to U.S. restraint and the weakness of France and South Vietnam. Now Johnson had removed the gun from the mantle, this would, or so they thought, soon change. There were also racial overtones. Many American commanders had little regard for the fighting ability of the Vietnamese. This was largely due to their disappointment with the ARVN, whose poor fighting quality some U.S. commanders then expected from all Vietnamese. Meanwhile, Johnson's advisors, especially McNamara, placed great faith in the military superiority of U.S. firepower, and believed this power combined with his analytical approach could produce results with mathematical efficiency. There's little discussion about what to do if things go wrong. That's not to say everyone in the administration is confident of success. Undersecretary of State George Ball consistently denies victory is possible, while others understand the Viet Cong has a strength equal, if not superior, to U.S. firepower. In 1964, David Ness, Deputy Chief of Mission in Saigon, tells Washington, the Viet Cong represents a grassroots movement which is disciplined, ideologically dedicated, easily identifiable with the desires of the peasantry, and of course ruthless. The American GIs arriving in Vietnam would soon find out just how ruthless the war would become. In 1965, tens of thousands of U.S. troops are heading for war in Vietnam. Backed up by B-52 bombers, helicopters, and napalm. Many expect the Viet Cong guerrillas to crumble in the face of unstoppable U.S. firepower. Instead, in the jungles and swamps of Vietnam, the Americans discover combat is an exhausting slog in which casualties are high and they rarely get to fire first. In summer 1965, 50,000 U.S. troops arrived in South Vietnam as part of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV. The USA hopes American troops and air power will be enough to compel North Vietnam to abandon its support of the Viet Cong insurgency, working to undermine the South Vietnamese government. Still, the U.S. approach will be gradual and mostly from the air. By late 1964, the U.S. has already been secretly bombing North Vietnamese supply lines in neighboring Laos. And in 1965, North Vietnam is hit as part of Operation Rolling Thunder. Still, the U.S. mostly hits secondary targets, not Hanoi, in order to force North Vietnam to negotiate an agreement beneficial to the South. In this sense, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson is not aiming for traditional territorial or total victory, but the prevention of a North Vietnamese victory over his allies in the South. North Vietnam claims no negotiations can take place while foreign troops remain in South Vietnam. And so, it seems combat, not compromise, will be the status quo in Vietnam. U.S. General William Westmoreland needs to develop a strategy to push the North out of South Vietnam at a low cost for the U.S., politically and militarily. This is a challenge, since political considerations mean his ground war must be confined almost entirely to South Vietnam. Johnson rules out any kind of conventional invasion of North Vietnam, as it will likely provoke Chinese intervention, as it did during the Korean War. The president also cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia, since he wants to limit ground operations. This, though, will make it harder for Westmoreland to isolate the battlefield. The American debate settles on two possible strategies in South Vietnam: conventional combat operations, or counterinsurgency focused on small unit operations and the political pacification of the South Vietnamese public. Although the counterinsurgency approach has its supporters, Westmoreland believes it requires more troops and gives the Viet Cong the initiative. Instead, he hopes to make use of the U.S. advantages in mobility and firepower in a strategy of annihilation. He plans to take the fight to the Viet Cong, eliminate them in large unit set-piece battles, and cause such heavy casualties North Vietnam cannot maintain the insurgency. It's a rapid attritional strategy. To achieve their goals, U.S. troops will not need to hold ground, but will carry out search and destroy operations at will. Original audio, U.S. Marine commentates search. This is going to be a methodical search, house by house, village by village, as we move north. This small group of huts here houses some of the Vietnamese families. We're looking mostly today for military-age men that may possibly be VC. So far, all we can see are women and children and old men. It's a plan with an institutional shift in the Department of Defense. Under Secretary Robert McNamara, the DoD adopts new statistical and quantitative management methods borrowed from the world of business. Everything about the war is quantified to assess progress and identify when North Vietnam reaches the critical tipping point when it can no longer sustain the struggle. Analysts and officers count everything from bomb tonnage to tent pegs. But the most important metric is the body count of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong killed in U.S. operations. Since the U.S. won't judge progress by territory captured in the same way as many traditional wars, the body count will form the basis for analyzing success. The Pentagon therefore encourages U.S. commanders to aim for higher kill, and capture counts as a means of realizing Westmoreland's strategy. The American kill count strategy expands the original passive protective role of the U.S. troops. Since now, they are to go on offensive patrols and take the fight to the Viet Cong, and they'll be doing it with new firepower. In an ideal search and destroy operation, U.S. troops identify a Viet Cong formation via intelligence and reconnaissance, and then quickly insert ground troops to pin the enemy down. As the battle intensifies and draws in more enemy, the U.S. troops call in airstrikes and artillery to decisively eliminate them. Similar operations had previously been carried out by ARVN. But American commanders felt they failed because the South Vietnamese troops' lack of fighting quality, as opposed to a problem with the actual tactics. To support their efforts, U.S. forces received new tools, vehicles, and weapons. From 1964, U.S. Army troops received the 5.56 mm M16 rifle to replace the 7.62 mm M14. The change will not always prove popular, but the U.S. military claims the M16 is lighter, more controllable and automatic, and can be carried with more ammunition. All important features in jungle combat, where ranges are shorter and resupply harder. Coupled with the M60 machine gun and M79 Thumper grenade launchers, U.S. platoons expect to bring heavy firepower against the more lightly armed Viet Cong. Perhaps the most important asset in a platoon is the radio, which can call in support from fire bases or aircraft. With much of South Vietnam consisting of jungle-covered highlands or swampy deltas, ground transport is slow to impossible. Instead, a brown water navy of patrol boats and hovercrafts navigate the rivers, while a new generation of American military helicopters provide unprecedented mobility. In particular, the UH-1 Iroquois, or Huey, replaces the cumbersome Shawnee to become the iconic vehicle of the Vietnam War, used for troop insertions, extractions, medical evacuations, resupply and fire support. Around a third of the 36 million helicopter sorties flown during the war are made by Hueys, U.S. jet aircraft, such as the F-4 Phantom and A-4 Skyhawk, also arrive to provide rapid close air support, including with napalm and white phosphorus, while the multi-minigun-equipped AC-47 Spooky gunship can provide overhead cover for hours at a time. U.S. helicopters have an early impact on combat. During the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965, air assault troops inflict heavy casualties on North Vietnamese regulars entering from Cambodia. Although the NVA launched some close-range assaults at landing zones, U.S. firepower pushes them back, including the first tactical use of B-52 bombers. Although most of the NVA escapes, the U.S. 1st Air Cavalry Division claim a 10-1 kill ratio, seemingly confirming air assault tactics and Westmoreland's strategy. At first, the helicopters also have a psychological impact on North Vietnamese troops. As North Vietnamese soldier Nguyen Quang Sang remembers, when helicopters spotted us, we had to run for our lives. It was terrifying. Once, when a helicopter dropped down especially close, I even saw the face of the door gunner. That was the first time I ever saw an American. I'm still haunted by it in my nightmares. By the end of 1965, the U.S. can claim to have prevented a South Vietnamese collapse and taken the fight to the enemy. But the Viet Cong also adapt and fight back. The mauling at Ia Drang encourages the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong to turn back to guerrilla tactics. This is partly due to practical considerations, but also a nuanced understanding of the U.S. political situation. North Vietnamese General Secretary Le Duan recognizes U.S. strength in Vietnam is undermined by a lack of political and public will back home. We can fight a protracted war, while the U.S. can't. although the U.S. can immediately send 300,000 to 400 sergeant troops at once. Why must the U.S. do it step by step? Because of fear of protracted war, and even stronger opposition of the American people and the world's people. Instead, the Viet Cong will take the lead in the South and employ strategies which had worked against ARVN. In 1963, U.S. General Frank Osmansky summarized on Viet Cong tactics. VC non-explosive weapons include caltrops, spike traps, poisoned darts, and even enraged water buffaloes. In a sense, their physical endurance, patience, and ingenuity are also VC weapons. For they have been known to live in dark tunnels for weeks, to remain underwater for long periods by breathing through hollow reeds, and to lie in ambush for as long as 48 hours. Sniping, mines, and booby traps become the principal means of Viet Cong attack. They prioritize mines since they maim just as often as they kill, draining U.S. resources and morale. The Viet Cong also become experts at launching well-planned ambushes, often targeting officers and radio men to prevent air support being called in. Most attacks are over in minutes. These tactics are aided by simplified logistics. A Viet Cong soldier carries as less as 5 kilograms of equipment in combat, compared to up to 40 for a U.S. soldier. The North Vietnamese can also draw on local supplies from friendly or coerced villagers. Additionally, they can blend into the local civilian population and call on irregular supporters who can perform labor, set mines, or collect unexploded U.S. ordnance for repurposing. Vast networks of tunnels, some even under U.S. bases, allow for the VC to infiltrate and protect their personnel and equipment from U.S. firepower. Parallel to the Viet Cong is the Regular People's Army of Vietnam, also known as the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA. Thanks to political regimentation, propaganda, and conscription, the NVA quickly expands with new Soviet and Chinese equipment. Soon, NVA units can claim to match U.S. squad firepower with weapons like the AK-47 automatic rifle, RPD machine gun, and rocket-propelled grenades. The Viet Cong are sometimes armed with WW-era weapons, but also receive newer equipment via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Soviet Union and China also provide protection against bombing, including engineering troops, anti-aircraft systems, and fighter jets, such as MiG-21s. North Vietnamese fighter ace Lu Hui Chau recalls one advantage he had over U.S. pilots. Once I had shot down an F-4, I was no longer scared of any type of American aircraft. The psychological factor is very important in any battle. Part of my confidence came from knowing that if I had to bail out, I would be landing in my own country. The North Vietnamese approach is to attack only when the situation favors them. As a result, they often neutralize U.S. technological advantages through patience and surprise. In fact, although helicopters dominate the news, the reality of combat in Vietnam is decidedly low-tech. One reason for this is that helicopters are expensive and valuable targets for the Viet Cong. Once familiar with helicopters, the North Vietnamese become skilled at shooting them down or targeting them at vulnerable moments. Their loud rotors make surprise almost impossible, allowing for ambushes at landing zones with RPGs or heavy machine guns. When the troops leaped from the lead choppers, the entire tree line erupted with small arms fire. A machine gun opened up from the hillside north of the LZ, pouring lethal fire into the helicopters. The rounds went smashing into the plexiglass cockpits. One bird rolled over like a great wounded bull elephant, T-rotor blades still whirring as they chopped into the earth. The U.S. loses around 5,000 helicopters during the war, about half to enemy action. To reduce the risk, helicopters drop off U.S. troops at more secure locations for long, sometimes multi-week patrols in the jungle. known to the GIs as humping the boonies. In these conditions, the Viet Cong are only one adversary for the Americans. Wildlife, mosquitoes, disease, exhaustion and dehydration affect U.S. troops too. With only 1% of patrols experiencing enemy contact, mines and booby traps are perhaps the biggest concern. They account for about a quarter of all casualties, as one 19-year-old U.S. soldier reports. It's an absurd combination of certainty and uncertainty. The certainty that you're walking in minefields, walking past things day after day. The uncertainty of your every movement, of which way to shift your weight, of where to sit down when there is contact. The Viet Cong almost always trigger the engagement with a 1966 report suggesting the North Vietnamese initiate around 79% of attacks. They also become skilled at predicting air support response times and withdrawing before it arrives, or attacking so close that air support threatens U.S. troops as well. By 1968, around 15 to 20% of U.S. casualties are from friendly fire. Original audio, U.S. soldier. As you come into the village, you always get this sniper fire, never fails. None, we invariably take casualties once in a while. We return fire, and by the time we get to the villages, these VC are gone, and it makes it very difficult and very frustrating for us. U.S. weapons also struggle in the jungle environment, especially the M16 rifle. A U.S. study records 10.5 malfunctions per 1,000 rounds fired in 1965. Overall, the M16's lightweight materials were sensitive to variations in propellant and poor lubrication. And many U.S. soldiers who arrive early on had no prior training with the M16 before arriving in Vietnam. Eventually, the Pentagon introduces modifications, like rust-resistant components, along with better maintenance training. By 1968, the M16's malfunction rate declines to around 3.8 malfunctions per 1,000 rounds, with the most serious ejection failures reduced to 0.32. Still, its early reputation persists, especially amongst Marines. The M60 machine gun also has its supporters and detractors. When functioning, troops value its versatility and morale-building firepower, including when mounted on helicopters. But others note its reliability quickly declines through wear and tear. With few replacement parts available, its high rate of fire also requires riflemen to carry heavy 7.62 ammunition and barrels. Overall, this mixture of combat stress, physical exhaustion, danger, and inability to fight back creates frustration among U.S. soldiers. You go out on patrol maybe 20 times or more, and nothing, just nothing. Then, the 21st time, zap, zap, zap. You get hit, and Victor Charlie fades into the jungle before you can close with him. U.S. troops in Vietnam are also under many additional stresses. Around a quarter are draftees, essentially conscripts, and their average age is only 19. Few of the American newcomers transfer to Vietnam as complete units, but instead arrive as individuals or in small groups. High officer turnover and the fact few experienced troops stay beyond their contracted tour of duty means combat experience is not retained and must be relearned. The stresses of combat, an elusive enemy, and peer pressure might partly explain, though not excuse, how cases of American violence against Vietnamese civilians become widespread. As the war continues, civilians suffer increasing violence, injury, and property destruction, both intentional and accidental, at the hands of U.S., ARVN, and Allied troops. Hostility, or at least ambivalence, from locals leads some U.S. GIs to conclude villagers support the Viet Cong. In many cases, this is true. Even a South Vietnamese government report estimates 5 million of the 17 million residents of South Vietnam support the insurgency. This realization undermines U.S. soldiers' belief in the war and promotes indifference to the plight of locals. Marine officer Philip Caputo is one who lost hope. When we marched into the rice paddies, we carried, along with our packs and rifles, the implicit convictions that we were doing something altogether noble and good. We kept the packs and rifles, the convictions we lost. U.S. reprisals against locals may result from anger at casualties, but also frustration at their inability to hit back at the VC. The State Department's Daniel Ellsberg joins a patrol in 1967 which destroys a civilian home. Their desire to burn the house was in part the result of frustration and in part reflected the fact that they honestly didn't know what might work. South Vietnamese civilians also experience violence from the Viet Cong. The escalation of the war in 1975 weakened support for the VC. So they resort to more coercion and political pressure to get recruits, supplies, and intelligence. Civilian contact with U.S. or ARVN troops also results in political accusations and denunciations. Lily Hayslip, a South Vietnamese villager, is attacked by the Viet Cong when her loyalty was doubted. She concludes, "After a while, our fear of the Viet Cong was almost as strong as our fear of the Republicans. If the Republicans were like elephants trampling our village, the Viet Cong were like snakes who came at us in the night. At least you can see an elephant coming and get out of the way." The psychological impact and tactical reality on the ground mean that by 1967, the war is a stalemate. When U.S. troops engage the enemy on their terms, they cause high casualties. But the nature of the fighting is taking its toll. North Vietnam is also carrying out a strategy of attrition, and arguably more successfully. But Westmoreland doesn't think North Vietnam is winning, in public at least. He emphasizes progress. By 1967, there are 485,600 U.S. troops in Vietnam, although Westmoreland wants even more. Original audio Westmoreland. Without question, the war is not stalemated. We are making steady progress, week by week, month by month. Needless to say, we've got a long way to go, but progress is definitely being made. I think there are sufficient men in Vietnam now to not lose the war. But if we could reinforce our present forces, I think we would accelerate our progress. Large-scale search and destroy operations in early 1967 seem to confirm Westmoreland's opinions. The U.S. claims it kills 2,000 enemy insurgents in Operation Cedar Falls and Junction City, while Westmoreland states there were fewer than 242,000 Viet Cong fighters left in the country. The reality is not so clear-cut. May CV's figures are almost entirely wrong. By establishing body counts as the metric for success, U.S. commanders inflate the figures, sometimes by double. Officers eager to show progress or ability post high estimates, or count civilian dead as Viet Cong according to a blunt unspoken rule: if it's dead and Vietnamese, it's VC. The focus on quantifiable data means concepts that aren't easily quantified, like morale, ideological support, and opinions of locals, are sidelined in a "if it can't be counted, it can't be important" mentality. But this attitude ignores vital elements of warfare, especially counterinsurgency operations, and applies clumsy numerical values to complex socio-political issues. The U.S. approach is also based on their estimations of North Vietnamese limits and capabilities. MACV consistently underestimates how North Vietnam can sustain high losses through its conceptualization of the conflict as a total people's war of revolutionary unification. The CIA, who are critical of the statistical methods, report as many as 600,000 enemy in South Vietnam in 1967, with 200,000 North Vietnamese entering draft age each year. Additionally, U.S. bombing has not brought victory. Although rolling thunder destroys 59% of power stations and 75% of oil storage in North Vietnam, this has little impact on a majority agrarian society and unmechanized military. Bombing is also expensive and dangerous. More sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons mean for every dollar of damage caused by bombing in 1967, the U.S. pays $9.50. Instead, U.S. bombing in pursuit of the body count is having a negative impact elsewhere. Americans are less likely to support the war, and international opinion is also turning against the U.S. In Sweden, India, and Japan, many people are publicly lauding the North Vietnamese for their resistance. In late 1967, Westmoreland and Johnson embark on a public relations tour of the U.S. to convince the people of their successes in Vietnam. Westmoreland tells the public, "The ranks of the Viet Cong are thinning. The end begins to come into view. The first months of 1968 will prove him disastrously wrong." At the end of 1967, the war in Vietnam is a stalemate. While the U.S. uses patrols and firepower to seek out and destroy the enemy, the Viet Cong insurgency carry out attritional guerrilla operations in South Vietnam, often dictating where and when battles take place. The result is high casualties for both sides and no meaningful strategic breakthrough, although U.S. Commander William Westmoreland sees it differently. In late 1967, he tours the U.S. to tell the public his strategy is working, and the North Vietnamese are reaching breaking point. Although Westmoreland is overly optimistic, there are fractures in the North Vietnamese Communist government. Some leaders, since labeled doves, are concerned about the cost in lives and infrastructure and want Hanoi to negotiate. They clash with more influential hawks, like General Secretary of the Communist Party Le Duan, who want to intensify the war. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese founder Ho Chi Minh is becoming politically sidelined. He has been chronically ill since at least 1964 and has stepped down from many official duties. North Vietnamese colonel and future dissident Bui Tin suggests Ho's ill health prevents him from introducing democratic reforms, allowing the Politburo and Le Duan to take further control. By 1967, the Soviet Union replaces China as North Vietnam's main supplier of firearms and heavy weapons. However, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev favors diplomatic solutions to the conflict, giving the North Vietnamese doves a temporary boost. To counter this, Le Duan and his supporters arrest political opponents and journalists, often on conspiracy charges. With his power base secure, the Hawks prepare for a new major offensive, which will see irregular and regular North Vietnamese units attacking cities and towns across South Vietnam during the Tet lunar holiday. North Vietnam hopes a surprise attack on urban centers and military bases will topple the Saigon government, destroy a major part of the U.S. and South Vietnamese ARVN forces, and pressure the U.S. to end its support for the South. Commanders understand the operation is risky. Therefore, the bulk of the fighting is assigned to the Viet Cong and not the more valuable regular North Vietnamese army, more commonly known as the NVA. From October 1967, military preparations begin when North Vietnamese troops harass U.S. border positions, including the combat base at Khe Sanh. Westmoreland believes North Vietnam is preparing another Dien Bien Phu-style attack. But others have since suggested that instead of repeating 1954, the North Vietnamese aim to draw U.S. and ARVN forces away from the major towns and cities. U.S. troops are relocated. Although North Vietnamese forces suffer heavy losses, Westmoreland reinforces Khe Sanh and thins out defenses around Saigon and other cities. And so, at the end of January 1968, both North and South Vietnamese prepare for the lunar holiday. Traditionally, This is a time of ceasefire across Vietnam. But this year, Viet Cong and NVA troops infiltrate towns and cities, sometimes disguised as festival goers, since it was common for farmers to enter cities with their produce during Tet. The presence of unknown individuals with cargo is not especially suspicious, at least to the Vietnamese. U.S. Lieutenant Colonel John E. Barr later recalled, "I noted the unusual number of young men in civilian clothes. Unusual in that most Vietnamese youths were either drafted by the ARVN or off in the hills with the Viet Cong. I was assured that it was customary for local farmers to come into Hue to celebrate the Tet holiday. I accepted his explanation, to my subsequent regret. U.S. military intelligence does detect the movement of North Vietnamese units, but doesn't understand the scale of the coming offensive. In reality, around 84,000 troops are waiting for the signal to attack across the country. At midnight on January 30th, North Vietnam launches the first coordinated attacks within hours. 5 of the 6 major cities in South Vietnam, 36 of 44 provincial capitals and 64 district capitals are under attack. Tuan Van Bon, a lieutenant in the Northern 320th Division, attacks a U.S. Marine base near Cam Lo. Around midnight, we moved as close as possible to the American perimeter. First, we fired a flare. That was the signal to detonate the dynamite that blasted holes in the perimeter. Within seconds, we blew a bugle and whistles to signal our troops to advance. All 400 of us moved forward screaming, "Attack! Attack! Attack!" In Saigon, a group of around 20 Viet Cong sappers blow a hole in the U.S. Embassy compound wall and attack the guards, armed with automatic weapons and rocket launchers. They attempt to breach the main chancellery building, but fail. U.S. diplomat Barry Zorthian calls Colonel George Jacobson, who lives in the embassy compound. George said that the VC sappers had penetrated his house and he could hear people downstairs. There was shooting outside on his side of the compound, shadowy figures floating around, and occasional bursts of gunfire. As far as he could tell, the embassy was still secure. He had a pistol, and after we hung up, he shot one of the sappers coming up the stairs. Jacobson kills the last Viet Cong sapper, ending the attack. Other VC attempts to enter the Saigon radio station and presidential palace also fail. After the initial shock, the U.S. and ARVN troops quickly reorganize and stage an effective defense in most places. U.S. commanders are impressed with ARVN, which stands its ground despite low American expectations. Within days, U.S. and ARVN troops reverse most Viet Cong and NVA gains. Although this is not the case everywhere, the old imperial capital of Hue boasts beautiful architecture and 19th century fortifications. But the city soon finds itself central to much more modern war. Hue had seen little fighting until 1968, and almost considered itself a truce city near the north-south border at the 17th parallel.